the United States. Sometimes I wonder whether it is 2016 we live in or 1962.
All right, let's talk more about this with CNN contributor Michael Weiss and CNN international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson joining me from Munich. All right, so Nick, first to you. Put this into context for us. Is this primarily because of the sanctions imposed by the West?
Well, Russia was coming in for a lot of criticism today. I mean, just prior to that, you had the French Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, saying that Russia's responsible for bombing civilians and that Russia in and around Aleppo in Syria, and Russia needs to stop that. There's been a lot of pressure on Russia over the past few weeks over that particular issue, and Russia continues to bomb those people in and around Aleppo right now. So what we've heard is a sort of a kickback from the Russian Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev. But I was sitting down just less than an hour ago with the NATO Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. That's General Philip Breedlove, U.S. four-star general. He is the military man in charge of NATO. Also, the U.S. European Command is in charge of that as well, wears several hats. And I said, what about this, about what Medvedev is saying, calling you, NATO, opaque, unfriendly, and slipping towards a Cold War? He said, look, opaque, he said, I just don't get that. Whenever NATO does military exercises, they're published, they're online, everyone knows when they're going to happen and where they're going to happen. Not the case in Russia. When the Russians go on military exercises close to the border, as he said, unfriendly, he said that's not the case. Indeed, Europe, NATO has been trying to reach out and be friendly towards Russia. But he says, look, Russia is changing its posture. Russia isn't just trying to rewrite the rule book here. He said Russia is trying to create new rules. He said, look, Russia went into Ukraine, crossed an international border, annexed Crimea. None of these things are sort of stand up to international law. And on top of that, NATO sees Russia developing what's known as A2AD, anti-area access denial, which are combined air, sea and land missile systems all the way from Kaliningrad in the north of Europe, St. Petersburg, Crimea, all the way down now to where Russian forces are in the north of Syria. So what he said, they see, NATO sees Russia clustering these A2AD systems, complex military systems in these areas, and they see that as not particularly a friendly gesture towards NATO and NATO countries. So I said, well, doesn't that amount to a slippage towards a Cold War? And he said, look, from our perspective, from NATO's perspective, we are not trying to head in that direction. But the implication is, across the border, Russia is upping these clusters of sophisticated defense systems as well as these other measures, annexing countries and crossing international borders.
Mm-hmm. And I know we just heard from Medvedev there, but maybe some people may not have understood every word he was trying to say with that translation. So I just do want to read this quote. He says, you could say even more sharply, we have fallen into a new Cold War. Nearly on a daily basis, we are being blamed for the most terrible threat to NATO as a whole, to Europe, to America, to other countries. They make scary movies where Russia starts a nuclear war. I sometimes wonder, are we in 2016 or 1962? So, Michael, is this hyperbole, or, is he simply underscoring that this lack of trust that has been long-standing seems to be going into a new direction?
I don't think it's hyperbole, but I think what he's espousing is what I call the Russian national security doctrine of Freudian projection. You accuse your enemy of that which you yourself are guilty. I can't count how many times President Obama and the U.S. defense establishment have said, in no uncertain terms, we do not want a new Cold War. This is not a zero-sum game. You'll recall that the so-called reset policy, where the U.S. prostrated itself to accommodate Russian interests, bringing Russia into the World Trade Organization, working closely with Russia to allow access for men and material into Afghanistan to combat the Taliban, which was a joint counterterrorism interest. Look, in the last 2-3 weeks, let's count the number of things that Russia has done to try and destabilize Europe, cleave alliances within the West, and combat or confront or contain American interests. Russia's most watched television network, Channel 1, fabricated a story in Germany alleging that a German-Russian girl in Berlin had been savagely raped by men of Arab or North African appearance. Now, this whole thing was bogus, as the German authorities had said from the start. It was designed to foment a social and political crisis in Germany. Why? Because Angela Merkel has been very hawkish on sanctions against Russia for, as Nick said, an unprovoked and unwarranted invasion of European soil, an annexation of European soil. So Vladimir Putin is looking to undermine the European Union. George Soros wrote a piece in The Guardian, our Project Syndicate, this week, saying that Putin is a greater threat to Europe than ISIS in the long term. Russia's bombardment of Syria around the clock has led to a catastrophic refugee crisis, between 50 and 70,000 people fleeing Aleppo for the Turkish border. Internally in southern Syria, and this doesn't get reported enough, 150,000 people are internally displaced in Deraa province. Added to which, the intervention in Syria, which was putatively to go after ISIS, has actually been strengthening ISIS. You know, another aspect that doesn't get reported. Colonel Steve Warren, the spokesman for the Pentagon, said Russia's sorties in Syria, only 10% of them are actually targeting ISIS. That means 90% are going after civilians, Free Syrian Army groups, U.S.-backed rebels. So this is designed really to undermine and weaken the Western position. And also, I mean, if there's a kind of leitmotif to it all, particularly in the Middle East, it is to make Moscow the regional power broker. If you want anything done in this part of the world, you don't go to Washington anymore, you go to Moscow. And that includes a peace deal with Bashar al-Assad. That includes talks about a revivified security establishment between Cairo, a traditional American ally, at least since the 1970s, and Moscow. That includes what the Saudis are up to. That includes an Iranian nuclear program. I mean, this is a great power in the making again. And I do think that, yes, we are in a Cold War footing, although one of the benefits that the Kremlin has, on its side is the U.S. just doesn't acknowledge it. We pretend like we're really not, that this is still a zero-sum game, and if we accommodate their interests, they'll do likewise in return. It just doesn't work that way, I'm afraid.
Interesting. All right, Michael Weiss, Nick Robertson, thanks to both of you. Appreciate it.
Sure.
All right, also this just into the CNN newsroom. Terror organization Al-Shabaab is now claiming responsibility